Hey everyone, welcome back to Movie Club. Today we're going to do a deep dive and break down the movie Backrooms, or as we call it, the Backrooms. This movie's story is totally tood. It's got both the surface plot and the subtext. And honestly, whenever you throw subtext into the mix, things get a little complicated and confusing. So that's what we're going to look at today. I'll give you a spoiler warning right now, and I'm going to play the beginning of the movie for you first. Keep the dialogues in your mind. Also, the music that plays alongside it is inspired by wind chimes, those little bells that ring when the wind blows, and in that part where it's explaining how our character is formed, it shows that the surface is soft, but we know that in the future it's gonna harden to a point where it's not easy to change anymore. Right off the bat, like we do with all our deep dive analyses on this channel, we're gonna check out the director's interviews to see what he said about the ending. This director gave an interview where he strongly emphasized that he's never gonna reveal the ending, and actually, he gets disappointed with directors who do spoil their own endings. But he did stress one thing. He said, "My movie is not a dream," meaning the whole story isn't just some person's hallucination, and it's not happening inside someone's head. That was straight from Kane Parsons himself. So our protagonist really did enter a world called the Backrooms. But now, what does that even mean? Better we start with the surface plot first. The core idea of the Backrooms is super creative and clever. It comes from video games. You guys probably know that sometimes when you're playing a game, suddenly a glitch happens. The player ends up somewhere they weren't supposed to go. Like, they were supposed to hit a wall, obviously, they shouldn't go through it, right? But sometimes a computer glitch or a software bug happens, and the player just phases right through the wall. And then what happens? The player went there because of a glitch. They weren't supposed to be there. And then more glitches keep happening, one after another. Why? Because when the player is in the game, the system is constantly answering a bunch of questions, right? Like, where is the player right now? What should be shown to them? What shouldn't be shown? Or, for example, the NPCs, those AI-driven characters, where should they be active? What items should we display? And which levels, from which angles, should be rendered for the player when the player suddenly goes through the wall and ends up somewhere else? The answers to all those questions become wrong. So the player ends up in a place full of errors and nonsense, because the system is trying to build the environment around the player. But since it wasn't programmed for a place like that, it creates a weird, glitchy environment. And another thing, since the player went somewhere they shouldn't be, all the NPCs disappear and the player suddenly becomes totally alone in the game. Now, the creators of this story came along and said, what if this happened in real life all of a sudden? Like, if you suddenly glitched through a wall in reality, meaning the physical laws of our world just had a major error. Then they say that if you go through a wall, you don't end up in the next room. You completely enter a brand new environment, because the system starts glitching nonstop, creating a new space for you that's full of errors, trying to copy the real world, but with a distorted, messy shape. And that person becomes totally alone there because no one else has access to that area. That's exactly why when we see the Backrooms environment, it feels familiar to us, but we don't actually recognize it. That's also what makes the movie scary. It feels like a place we think we've seen before, but we have no memory of it. Now the creators came up with a backstory for it. They say that in 1988, a company that made MRI machines, and MRI machines are basically super powerful magnets, right? They were working on their new experiments when suddenly, by accident, their experiment led them to a new discovery. Now, the writer of the story actually matched that exact experiment date with a real earthquake that happened in the US, like In reality, on that same date, there was actually an earthquake in America. The theory is that what that company did caused a glitch in reality itself. The physical laws of our world got violated, and they opened a gateway to a new world, which they named the Backrooms. But in the story, it's not totally clear whether what they did actually created the Backrooms, or if the Backrooms already existed, and they just found a way in. Some theories say the Backrooms didn't exist at all. They were created because of what that company did, just like in video games. And when the Backrooms come into existence, they don't just have one gateway. They open up to multiple random places and try to copy the Backrooms environment based on those places. Like if a doorway suddenly opens up to a furniture store, parts of those Backrooms will resemble that furniture store. We could even see the exact same furniture there. But the Backrooms take inspiration from two things. The second thing they take inspiration from is the memories of the people who enter this world. For example, if someone actually has a red-headed wife and enters this world, they'll see a red-headed woman there too. So here we realize something: the Backrooms are infinite, because they're built from memories. Every door you open takes you to a new place that's inspired by your memories, and it's full of glitches and mistakes. Whether it's copying the real world, it's full of errors, or using our memories, it's still messed up, because we don't even remember our memories perfectly, so everything's flawed again. Like that red-headed woman, we can see nothing about her is quite right. Then in 1989, this company finally succeeds in opening a stable gateway to this world. As a result, they permanently shut down their MRI machine production. The company's goal is to build an infinite space. They want to commercialize it. Just imagine, like warehousing or huge retail environments, anything could be built so easily with this tech. But that's where things get dangerous. When this company built the Backrooms, accidents started happening. Some people got lost. Some people who had no clue what the Backrooms even were suddenly got pulled in and ended up trapped in this world. Because like I said, it doesn't have just one door, it opens doors to random places. We saw one example, that kingfisher bird. Since its appearance had no flaws, it was clearly real. It was an actual bird that had accidentally entered the Backrooms through a gateway. Also, when one of our characters entered the Backrooms, they saw some decorative ship containers mounted on the wall, like maybe there was a cafe near the beach and the gateway opened from there. And later we saw a wooden mannequin placed there saying, "Welcome," in all the languages of the world, trying to guide people. So clearly, people from all over the world are being drawn into the Backrooms. So the Backrooms aren't bound by space. One door could be here. Another door could lead to China, for example. And that mannequin was placed there by that very company. Later, when Mary went into that company's facility, she saw a whole bunch of those wooden mannequins there, so it was obvious the company had put them there. And we see in the story that there are some people wearing protective suits, talking to each other via radio. These are the company's employees. They're trying to run experiments on this space to figure out how to commercialize it. Whatever accident happens, they cover it up. Like many times before, their own people have been killed or gone missing in there, but every time the company hushes it up. Another really interesting point: one time, one of their agents went missing for only 2 hours, but when they were found later, they realized that 3 months had passed in the real world. So the Backrooms don't just mess with space, they mess with time too. If someone gets lost in the Backrooms, they might end up in a different time period. All this info I'm giving you comes from the director's own YouTube channel. By the way, there's a whole bunch of other videos about the Backrooms lore, and that's where all this info comes from. For example, he tells on his channel that one time, an employee of the company died. Later, some weird bacteria, like all the other weird stuff in that world started growing on the corpse. But again, the company covered it up so it wouldn't hurt their profits. In the movie itself, we saw one of their employees getting killed by the monster like Clark. At that moment, when he was killing them, we could see his wooden leg. Now you might be wondering, how is it possible that Clark's monster version already existed in this world when Clark himself hadn't even entered the Backrooms yet? There are two possible answers. One is that when the Backrooms was copying the real world and creating an imperfect version of the furniture store where we could see all of Clark's furniture store components, like the sign he had on the wall, or his king chair he used in his promo video, everything was flawed and incomplete. At that same time, it also made a copy of Clark, and because it was incomplete, it made something like a monster. The second answer is that maybe this monster was created after Clark entered. Then it moved through the Backrooms rooms, ended up in a different time period, came back to the past, and killed that company employee. Alright, that's the surface plot. Now let's slowly get into the subtext. There are 4 important parts in the movie that make up the subtext. One is the first therapy session. Second is the promotional video for Mary's audiobook. Since Mary had an audiobook she was trying to sell, she made ads and said some sales, pitch type stuff. Those were totally subtext. Third is when the therapy session gets repeated. And the fourth moment is when Mary smiles at the end of the movie. These 4 points are officially the subtext. In the audiobook sales part, we understand that the creators did something really clever. They say, since the Backrooms is built from people's memories, then practically when we enter the Backrooms, it's like we've entered our own subconscious. Like when Mary went into the Backrooms and saw her childhood neighborhood, a neighborhood that was super important in shaping her personality, because her childhood trauma happened right there. Since the environment is built from our memories, all those memories that shaped our personality take physical form in the Backrooms. Even the other aspects of our personality, or in other words, our shadow self, gets depicted as a physical but imperfect person in the Backrooms. The idea the director used here is really similar to the movie Enemy, the one Denis Villeneuve made. In that movie, the whole city was actually happening inside Jake Gyllenhaal's head. The second character in the film wasn't real at all. It was all in the main character's head, and they called the movie Enemy, because the second character was the shadow of the first, or the dark side of the protagonist, and they named it Enemy, because he was ruining the main hero's life. Now in the Backrooms, they gave it a monster-like aspect. Anyone who enters the Backrooms gets a monster version of their dark personality traits created there. The psychology book Mary is promoting is basically explaining the Backrooms. In her ad, she said that when we're kids, our brains build barriers on our behavior based on memories and events to stop us from doing certain things. It tries to protect us with these barriers. How? For example, a kid raised in a toxic family slowly turns into someone who can't get close to others because they learn that being intimate and close to loved ones means getting hurt. Well, in childhood, that helps them. It makes them distance themselves from their toxic parents. But later, when that kid grows up, that becomes their behavioral pattern. They become someone who pushes others away and can't form healthy relationships. And Mary in her audiobook had said, "If you come to me, I'll help you find your destructive behavioral patterns." There are hundreds of those patterns. The example I gave about not being intimate is just one. Then in Mary's ad, interestingly, she was metaphorically describing the Backrooms. She said the barriers our brains build are like walls, and they create a maze of inner rooms in our minds. If you come to me, I'll help you find those patterns and open a window in those walls. And again, that whole opening a window. thing was a metaphor for her own childhood when she couldn't even look out the window. So up to here we realize that they turned this psychological idea into a physical thing called the backrooms. Now we have two main characters in the story, Mary and Clark, and both of them have these destructive behavioral patterns. Mary has one client, Clark, whose life situation we all saw. His problem is that he can't take responsibility for his own mistakes, so he's not willing to solve his issues. You've definitely seen people like this around you, the ones who blame everyone else, never take the blame. Their necks are stiff. As a result, they repeat the same mistake 100 times. These are people who got hurt in childhood when they took responsibility. They were damaged by having accountability. So they learned to never take responsibility for anything, and whatever misfortune they have is always someone else's fault. That's why in the therapy sessions, Mary tries to get Clark to recreate his memories and realize that the problem in his life isn't alcohol or his bad job. It's that whenever he feels failure in his life, he turns it into anger against others and picks fights. Mary said, "The goal of our exercise is that whenever you feel the urge to blame someone else, you catch it in that moment and make a different choice. In other words, become aware of the pattern." But every time they did that in therapy, they'd fail, and Clark would lose his temper and repeat the same wrong behavior. In the therapy session, we saw Clark's bad pattern. He'd feel failure. Then, instead of accepting it, he'd blame others, insult people, push them away, become lonelier. Then use that loneliness as proof that the world was against him. Then feel failure again. So Clark is stuck in a psychological loop. That's why the therapist told him, "You have no friends." She was basically telling him that with these behaviors, he's pushing everyone away. That's also why Clark was sleeping in the furniture store. And this idea that the backroom's gateway opens inside a furniture store was actually a really clever concept, because furniture stores look like homes, but they're not real. They look like bedrooms, but they're not actual rooms. Just like the backrooms, it's not real, and that's exactly where the gateway opened. Mary also has a destructive behavioral pattern. She wants to save everyone. So the person who wrote a book about helping others is actually messed up herself. In her childhood, she lived with her mother, who had a mental disorder and was afraid of the outside world. So she covered up all the windows and wouldn't let Mary go outside. Eventually, when Mary was a kid, she couldn't help her mom because she was just a child, and her mom ended up in a mental institution. Because of that psychological wound, Mary became a psychologist to help people like her mother. We saw Mary's psychological wound in several scenes. Like, she carried that concrete stone with her handprint from childhood everywhere she went to remember her mom. She wanted to help others so they wouldn't end up like her mother. And later at a party, we saw her watch a child with its mother, which reminded her of her own mom and made her feel awful, so much that she couldn't stay at the party and had to leave. Because of this same behavioral pattern, Mary suddenly went into the furniture store when she saw Clark had disappeared. Even though she shouldn't have done that, when a patient goes missing, you call the police or report it. You don't go into a strange place yourself. But her pattern made her jump into that trouble all alone. And the fact that they showed her childhood wound on the concrete was itself a metaphor that when we're kids, our minds are like soft concrete, easily shaped, but later when it hardens, it's not so easy to change. Now the story gets even more interesting. Mary enters the back rooms and finds Clark there. His spirit is completely broken. His nerves are fried.
There's a theory floating around online that Clark had probably been there for a very long time, because as soon as he saw her, he said, "You came too late." And like I said, the back rooms mess with time, so Clark might have lived alone in this world for years.
Because later we saw that he knew the environment perfectly, He was actually talking to his monster version. He had connected with it. He had brought in the rest of those half-baked memories and even trained them, like, to turn lights on and off. He had brought in the rest of those half-baked memories, like, who are these people here? One of them is a copy of Clark's own wife. The other two, one was a little kid, and the other a middle-aged man. Clark didn't know them, but he said they're copies of other people who are probably living their real lives out there in the world. So these are imperfect copies of people that appear here, and we saw several of them that had sunk into the ground and were stuck there.
When Mary enters the Backrooms world, she's basically entered Clark's subconscious, because the whole space was copied based on Clark's memories. Clark jumps on Mary and chokes her, knocking her unconscious, which is why later at the end,
we see Mary sitting in an interrogation room with bruises on her neck. That's from this scene, and they replay the therapy session. This is the peak moment of the movie. The whole message is right here, the main subtext. And since the Backrooms itself is a distorted copy of the real world, the interesting thing is that Clark also creates a distorted version of the therapy session here. So even the therapy session is an imperfect copy of the original one. Here we realize that Clark, in this new therapy session, wants to repeat his old bad pattern again. He wants to blame everyone else all over again. This is where Mary realizes her own mistake. She understood that just making people aware of their patterns isn't enough. It's like Mary kind of knew this deep down already, because once she was watching her own audiobook ad on TV and had no expression on her face like she knew something was off, that the method she was promoting doesn't work. And here, in the therapy session,
she admits it. She says, I can't help you because just understanding the patterns isn't enough. Just labeling our traumas isn't enough. Even going to therapy isn't enough.
The problem only gets solved when people actually want to change. This is exactly where Clark failed. Clark puts all the blame on the world again.
He won't even take responsibility for attacking Mary. He says, I attacked you because that's just my nature. Still not clearly accepting it.
He wouldn't even take responsibility for the death of his own workers, the fact that he kept that severed head in the closet. He still wouldn't own up to that person's death. And in his speech, he was even repeating Mary's own lines. He was repeating those bad behavioral patterns, so it was obvious he understood where the problem was, but he had no will to change. And here's something really interesting. The reason he cut off his wife's hair and put it on Mary was because in the first therapy session, Mary had told Clark, "You didn't do anything wrong." And Clark wanted to hear exactly those words from his wife's mouth. So he cut her hair, put it on Mary, and wanted to replay the entire therapy session from the beginning just to hear that same sentence. But this time Mary realized what was going on and didn't say that. She told him, "You have to take responsibility for your actions," because Mary had realized her own mistake, and she told Clark, "You need to have the will to change." Then Clark said something really important. "I'm more comfortable here," which is a metaphor, that people are more comfortable in the world they've built for themselves, and literally feeding off their memories, which they actually showed in the movie. People literally eating memories. Clark said, "I don't want to change.
I don't want to go through the hardship of changing." But the exact opposite happened to Mary. Mary realized her mistake. Mary said, "I can change." She turned to Clark and said, "I can't help you." And that was the first time in her life she'd ever said that. She said, "If you want to stay here, stay, I don't care. Just let go of my arm, I'm leaving." For the first time in her life, she wanted to leave without looking back, without feeling bad for not helping him. And in an even more interesting turn,
Right when Clark said, "I don't want to change," his monster version suddenly appeared. Clark went and talked to that monster, saying, Don't worry. We don't have to change. We're fine just the way we are. And then that monster picked him up and destroyed him.
This is a metaphor that destructive behavioral patterns, apart from being identified, also need a solution, otherwise they destroy our lives. That's why we saw Clark's imperfect wife get scared and run away when she saw the monster version, even though in reality he had kicked her out of the house and she wasn't scared of him. That's because Clark's wife didn't know what kind of monster actually lived inside Clark. Clark thought he could live in peace by just denying everything. But destructive patterns aren't like pets, they destroy a person, and that's exactly what the movie showed. So the surface plot is Clark getting killed by his own imperfect copy in the back rooms, and the subtext is Clark's life being destroyed by his own destructive behavioral patterns. But Mary was different. Mary realized her mistake, so she got up to escape. There were a few interesting scenes as she walked past the monster. She looked back at it, and we could see in her eyes that she still felt sorry for it. So even though she was still in her old pattern, she hadn't fully become a new person yet, she still felt pity, even for a monster. But she realized she shouldn't give in to that pattern and needed to make a different choice. Another cool scene, when she passed the monster, she suddenly opened a door and ended up in a new place, her childhood neighborhood, which didn't exist before Mary entered the back rooms and was created right there at that moment. And here we realize the back rooms are infinite. Every door you open creates another door based on your memories. Then, in a really beautiful metaphorical scene,
when Mary gets trapped, she takes that same stone representing her childhood wound, the source of her bad pattern, and smashes it into the monster's head. First of all, that concrete actually broke. It was destroyed, meaning that childhood wound was gone.
And then Mary managed to escape and save herself, unlike Clark, who was destroyed. So at this point, the movie gives us the solution for how to get rid of these monsters. Unlike the moment when they were reconstructing the therapy session and Mary got confused saying, "I don't know how you can get rid of this problem." Now in this scene we realize that first, people need to become aware of their wrong behavioral patterns, what mistake they keep repeating that ruins their lives. Then they need to understand where that trauma came from. And they have to realize that even though it's not their fault the pattern was formed in childhood, later in adulthood, if we keep continuing that behavior, we're actually choosing to live that way, and people need to have the will to fix themselves. Now we get to the fourth part of the movie. We see the company's agents come and find Mary. Then we see them pick up Clark's monster and put it under a machine that looks like an MRI, so they clearly want to run experiments on everything. And interestingly,
This company used to make MRI machines, and MRI is something that takes images of the brain, right, exactly like what the Backrooms does. Then we see a guy from that company who had seen Clark through the security cameras.
And then we see Mary, they kind of imprisoned her, took her to a place like an interrogation room. Mary realized what kind of people they were. She turned and said, "What exactly are you going to do with me?" And he gave a vague answer. It's clear they're not going to free Mary like all the other cover-ups. They're going to do the same thing to her, maybe even drown her. What happens to Mary we'll have to see in Backrooms too. Then a really important moment happens. Mary suddenly smiles.
While Mary was in the interrogation room, the man sitting across from her started obsessively talking about his own problems, saying, "I expect from you," meaning he expected Mary to help him solve these issues.
He was even using words that sounded like therapy language. That's how he talked, saying, "I'd like to explore the issue together with you." And interestingly, Mary suddenly tuned out of his words. His voice got quieter and quieter, and instead, the sound of wind chimes, the ones connected to Mary's childhood, started to be heard. So Mary was thinking about her childhood in that moment. That's why she couldn't hear the man's voice. And then she smiled. Why?
Because she recognized her own destructive pattern. Because once again, she was sitting in a room with a man across from her asking her to help him solve his problems.
And every time in her life Mary said, "I'll definitely help," and threw herself into trouble, or in other words, she'd worry and stress out. But this time she saw the pattern and she's not going to help this man sitting in front of her. And because she's now become a new person, she smiled. She's not going to repeat her old wrong path. Then the image gets even cooler. The camera pulls out of the interrogation room and goes back into the back rooms. The camera shows a ton of new rooms that have nothing to do with Clark or the furniture store. Tons of new rooms have formed, all related to Mary's personality. We see her childhood neighborhood, the ruins of her house, and even that sign of the company that was supposed to build a tower there is present. All of this is connected to Mary's personality, and most importantly, an imperfect, monster-like version of Mary is also sitting in the interrogation room, but in the back rooms, which shows that even Mary still has that monster inside her, the one she just discovered, meaning that our memories and traumas, even if we find them, we're not going to forget them or kill them. They're forever in our minds, and we have to keep them under control for the rest of our lives. And now, if you go back and listen to the movie's opening dialogues, they'll mean something totally different to you this time. Alright guys, that was our deep dive analysis of the Backrooms movie. Hope you found it interesting. Honestly, for a 21-old YouTuber, it was a really good film.